Good afternoon, everybody. I'm making this video for everyone who might be taking World Literature 2 online. This is actually the first time in several years that I've taught World Literature 2, so I'm very excited about it. And I wanted to make this first video on J. Hector St. John de Crevecouer's Letters from an American Farmer. You might ask yourself, this seems like a strange work to start an entire literature class off. Shouldn't I be reading some poems, perhaps, or maybe some short stories, even a novel? This time period that we are beginning our work with in English 201 is called English 205 is called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment period this goes beyond literature. Okay, this extends over into philosophy and science, intellectual history in general, politics. The Enlightenment period began in the mid 18th century, even the early stages, if you want to trace it back that far. The general attitude about it is we need to explain the world using science, using philosophy, using our own reason over trying to come up with explanations, especially on the religious or supernatural levels. If you think back to the century before, the 17th century, it was a century plagued by religious violence and turmoil. Of course, the Protestant Reformation happened in 1517. When that happened, religious violence spread everywhere. Catholics and Protestants were constantly fighting each other. For example, in Ireland, um, Catholicism mostly stayed the predominant strain of Christianity, but on the English Isles as well as Scotland, Protestants became the main form of Christianity. In the main English Isles, it was the Anglicans. In Scotland, it was mostly the Presbyterian Calvinists. And all these different groups fought each other, killed each other. England even had a civil war due to religious differences. I mean, it had something to do with the power of the monarch and the king and all that, but it also had stuff to do with religion. Likewise, think about America in the 1600s, the Salem witch trials. You saw the evidence of that in America. These different, especially in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the people who immigrated there were already kind of religious radicals. They were too radical for England, so they immigrated over here. And everybody who immigrated here was isolated from the mainland. They were isolated off in the wilderness. And you started to see religious hysteria growing. Suddenly, people started seeing the sign of the devil in everything all at once. They started suspecting these poor innocent women of being witches. And many women died being burnt to death because of this hysteria. By the time we get to the 1800s, a lot of these intellectuals were thinking, enough of that. It's not that the people in the Enlightenment period were atheists, by far not true, but they wanted to explain the world using science, using reason and philosophy. And Crevecouer is one example of such a guy. Okay, he was writing this letters from an American farmer in the 1750s before the American nation was founded. And what he's interested in this project, he's kind of adapting this fictional persona of a fictional farmer. Okay, he's writing letters back home to Europe. What he's trying to do is explain what makes the American people in this new colony different from the rest of Europe. he's trying to explain things like human behavior through, today we think of the study of psychology as human behavior. He's trying to explain human behavior through science and observation rather than doing something like a theological study of good and evil or something of that nature. What makes, why, especially when thinking about people who are immigrating over here to America, what makes them different? What makes them tick? I gave you this letter as a way of starting because you see this kind of attitude in the air with what he's trying to do in his study. He's trying to explain things like, what kind of food do people eat? How does that change their mood and temperament? What's the weather like wherever they are? How does that change their mood and temperament? And in this Letters from an American Farmer, he does just this. In the earliest days of the American Republic, even before it was founded, you started seeing two competing visions of America. One was the vision founded by Thomas Jefferson, which was America as a country that should be founded on the labor of small farmers. Small farmers. You think back to like what life was like in Europe. You had these rich aristocrat landowners who owned all the land. Most of the time, the people were laborers working on somebody else's land. It was rare that you owned your own land. And when people did that, there wasn't too much room for growth or opportunity. They were just kind of subservient to the people who they worked for. It was hard to kind of advance in life when you're always working under someone else. Jefferson and Crevecouer both kind of believed that we as a nation would be best off if we all were small farmers. We grew our own crops. Maybe we got a little extra money by selling the surplus. We would all be better off doing that. There wouldn't be a great divide between rich and poor. Maybe like the doctor and the lawyer in the town would probably be the richest people. Other than that, there's not a great division of wealth. There's nobody up at the top lording over everybody else who owns all the property. When people in the 1700s came to America, they saw this whole nation full of open land ready to explore. A lot of people immigrated over here to get a little piece of the pie because there was no pieces of the pie in Europe. Crevecouer is kind of suggesting in his Letters from an American Farmer, this is the ideal way to live. Compare that to the other vision of America, which Alexander Hamilton is known for. America with its vast land, the industry of the people. We would be better served creating a nation of manufacturing and industry, factories, and big cities. In order to have a lot of factories, usually you see those in big cities. Think of the Industrial Revolution that took place in the 1900s, late 18, early 1900s. People started flocking to big cities. Capitalism at its finest, right? People would own the manufacturing. You would work for them. A little different than what Jefferson and Crevecouer are proposing. That is, of course, the vision that came true rather than the nation of small farmers. My point here is that there's lots of discussion. What should this country be like? And these Enlightenment thinkers like Crevecouer, again, they wanted to divorce the study of the human being from the study of theology, do it more through a scientific lens. And Crevecouer here does a lot of interesting things in defining the American character. And these are things that we all still take for granted today. So let me show you the text, have the reading pulled up. This this is his letter 3. What is an American? Crevecouer's setting for this is a small agricultural Pennsylvania. If you've ever been to Pennsylvania and you've driven anywhere that's not Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Penn State, right? The whole state is nothing but flat farmland for the most part. So his fictional persona is kind of imagining what would it be like, or what is it like to be a farmer in Pennsylvania. And again, he's explaining things like the human being, how this effect of being a small landowner, how does it change us? How does it make us different than our European counterparts? There's a great sentence before I show you the passage in question. There's a great sentence here. It says, "Men are like plants. The goodness and flavor of the fruit proceeds from the peculiar soil and exposition in which they grow. We are nothing but what we derive from the air we breathe, the climate we inhabit, the government we obey, the system of religion we profess, the nature of our employment. Here you will find but few crimes. These have acquired as yet no root among us. I wish I was able to trace all my ideas. My ignorance prevents me from describing them properly. I hope I shall be able to delineate a few of the outlines, which are all I propose." So, a human being is like a plant. Depending on where we set root, depending on how we put ourselves in the soil of the earth, it kind of limits how much we can grow. If you think about, like, if you have a garden, maybe if like you have a plant in a pot, the plant can only grow so far depending on the limit of the pot and the depth of the soil. Human beings are like that. Crevecouer is kind of suggesting here that Americans, when they come here, they can get their hands in the earth, plant their feet somewhere, set roots. It changes us compared to the Europeans. This passage up here is what I most want to draw your attention to, because it's probably, this idea is something that we still talk about today. So let me highlight where I'm looking. I'll zoom in a little. Crevecouer says, "What attachment can a poor European immigrant have for a country where he had nothing? The knowledge of the language, the love of a few kindred as poor as himself were the only cords that tied him. His country is that which gives him land, bread, protection, and consequence. Ubi panis ibi patria." That means where there is bread, there is one's fatherland. It's the motto of all immigrants. What then is the American, this new man? He is either a European or the descendant of a European, hence that strange mixture of blood which you will find in no other country. I could point out to you a family whose grandfather was an Englishman, whose wife was Dutch, whose son married a French woman, and whose present 4 sons have now 4 wives of different nations. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. He becomes an American by being received in the broad lap of our great alma mater. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. So that last sentence is the kind of analogy and metaphor that Crevecouer is doing. If you think about metal, I can stop sharing now. If you think about metal, when you heat it up to a certain temperature, you can mold the metal. And whenever you do that, it changes the composition and the substance of the metal. Crevecouer is suggesting here, and when you bring all these immigrants over to America, you throw away all the customs that you gain from Europe. So maybe you're an Irish immigrant. Okay. Maybe maybe you're an Irish immigrant. You love the Catholicism. You love certain things, like certain ways of dress and such. When you come to America, you give all of that up. If you want to think about it more in terms of other nations, think about like maybe your English is not your native language. Come to America, well, you better learn it because you give up your Spanish or your French or Russian or Italian or whatever when you move here. You give up that old identity, you're melted away. That old identity is melted away, and when you cool down again, you're now an American, and you have to kind of give up your old habits, your old customs. When you plant roots in the soil here, you see the freedom in which like being something like a small town farmer gives you. That changes you. That changes who you are. You're no longer a Scotsman. You're no longer an Irishman. You're no longer Welsh. Whatever the case is, you're now an American. This idea, when you think about it today, causes some controversy. If you guys watched the Super Bowl this past year, you might recall the Bad Bunny halftime show. A lot of people were like ticked off because the halftime show was a guy singing in Spanish the whole time. How dare they? These immigrants, Hispanic immigrants or Puerto Ricans or whatever, need to adapt to American customs. If they want to be here, they need to learn English. You saw a lot of it got to the point where they made their own halftime show with Kid Rock, of all people. Okay, don't get me started on how dumb that was. But the people who got upset about it believed in this idea of the American melting pot. Whenever you come here, you should give all that other stuff up. You could have looked at that something like that halftime show in a different way. Um, if you think about it, if you go back and watch the show again, you see you started like Bad Bunny, for instance, would show like the Puerto Rican flag alongside the American flag. He would show all these different people who came here. Just because people who came here are different doesn't mean they're not Americans. We're a country founded on different people coming here, blending together, creating something new. So a lot of people today kind of think if you come to America, you should learn English. You should learn our customs, learn our habits. Um, that's a controversial idea. This is an idea that Crevecouer kind of invented in our popular culture, the American melting pot. Throughout the whole rest of this thing, he explains this. He talks, for instance, about religion, how, especially in Europe, depending on what part you were from, different parts have different religious sentiments. For instance, I said Scotland usually took more of like a Presbyterian Calvinist view, meaning he believed in predestination, he believed in getting rid of the pomp and circumstance in the church, get rid of all these graven images and such. When you come to America, everybody has their own piece of the pie. Nobody has more, not many people have more than others. You give all that up. And when it's not hot in the air, when people aren't so concerned about it like they are in Europe, when you come to America, you still will be a Christian. Maybe you don't care as much about these regional differences anymore. Crevecouer is kind of paving the way here for something like freedom of religion. Think about in Europe, a lot of the countries kind of adopted an official religion. The French were Catholic. The mainland English developed their own church. The Irish have traditionally been Catholic. come here to America, don't have to worry about that anymore. He also spends some time in this letter talking about mountaineers. Like, mountaineers, we're all mountaineers. We're here in West Virginia. If you're a mountaineer, you're not kind of rooting yourself in soil anywhere. You're kind of like a nomad, hunting animals, trying to live off the land that way. He thought that was kind of barbaric. You shouldn't do that, because if you don't place your roots in the soil, then you're going to become uncivilized and almost barbaric. Think about people who live in like the extreme backwoods today, how there's a whole horde genre based on that, stuff like Wrong Turn, okay? Crevecouer thought that if you weren't constantly getting your hands dirty, planting yourself in the soil, that was bad. Likewise, in the letter 9 description of Charlestown, I gave you that because Crevecouer visits the South. So compared to like the more temperate climate of the North in Pennsylvania, he goes to Charlestown, South Carolina, Charleston, and he feels the extreme heat in the air. He notices that the farm owners there, it wasn't these small farmers like you see up in the North. Started seeing these large plantations. These rich landowners came and bought these large chunks of land to make plantations. They did not work that land themselves. They had a slave class to do that for them. He kind of speculated things like the hot weather. Nobody wants to be out in the hot weather when it's 100 degrees with 100% humidity outside. Hot weather caused especially like the southern white plantation class to develop laziness. He said whenever they were bored and they weren't working all day, they ate more. They ate food that I think today, like deep fried food's popular in the South. They ate all this food. Oftentimes the men, he said, didn't live very long lives. Likewise, he talks about slavery. He decries the evils of slavery. He says, when these poor slaves, right there, they're plants, they're rooted here in the soil, but there's no nurturing, right? They're not treated with kindness, empathy, or respect. And being a plant, they suffer and wither and decay. The slaves don't live long lives. He even describes one slave in awful detail, talking about the slave committed a crime and killed his overseer. So they locked the poor guy up in a cage until he starved to death. Before he even died, the birds were already picking away at his flesh. He's like, ugh, something's not right here in the South. This isn't. You see some bad habits, bad customs developing here. So he even kind of just tries to come up with like this sociological explanation of why the South developed the way that it did with slavery and such. This is Crevecouer's Enlightenment project in a nutshell. Let's explain the character of an entire race of people, Americans. Americans are people made up of all other races, even regional differences. How do regional differences and things like how does whatever you're eating, how does that change? How does that change you? And as we keep going, you guys will read Thomas Jefferson next. Thomas Jefferson does this to a level that is extreme. You will find that when he does stuff like talk about race, he tries to explain it in a scientific way. and a lot of like prejudices that people have about race and such. You can even today you can still see that in his writings. He's not doing it necessarily to be mean and ill-tempered. He's doing it thinking that he's being clever. He's observing his slaves. He's noticing characteristics about them. He's trying to kind of lump them into a box, a taxonomy. This is what they're interested in, explaining everything through reason, almost to a fault. Okay. So I hope this video helped. If any of you suffered through having to listen to me, if I notice people are watching them, I'll try to keep doing them as we keep going through the semester, especially things that I haven't taught in a long time. Until later, guys, take care. See you next time.